Sunlight bleeds through the glass, illuminating a thick haze of ozone and burnt circuits. A $10 million turbine stands dead, a useless mountain of cold, unmoving high-tech steel. Silence costs $50,000 a minute, bleeding the company's massive fortune dry. Red lights pulse like a flatlining heart. David, a grease-stained father, stands at the edge. His son, Lucas, clutches a backpack, watching with wide eyes. Elite engineers scream over tablets, their degrees failing them. Rachel, the millionaire owner, watches her empire crumble. David speaks. Fixed in 15 minutes. Rachel erupts into mocking laughter. Nobody believes a man with dirty hands. David Miller was 41 years old, and for the last 5 years, he had learned the art of disappearing. Being a single father changes a man's priorities. You no longer work for glory. You don't work for titles. You work for the milk in the fridge and the shoes on your son's feet. David was currently a freelance maintenance contractor. That was a fancy way of saying he was the guy they called when they wanted cheap labor for dirty jobs. He worked day-to-day contracts, no benefits, no security, just a paycheck at the end of the shift. But David wasn't always a ghost in the machine. Years ago, he was a lead high-voltage systems engineer for one of the largest firms in the country. He was the man who designed the fail-safes. He was the one who saw the invisible currents. But honesty is a dangerous trait in a world of profit margins. When David discovered a massive safety flaw in a government-funded project, he did the unthinkable. He spoke up. He refused to sign off on a lie. In return, the company crushed him. They didn't just fire him, they blacklisted him. They whispered in the ears of every recruiter. They turned his reputation into ash. He lost his house. He lost his savings. He lost his wife to the stress of a life falling apart. Now he lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment where the heater rattled in the winter, and he spent his days fixing things that other people broke. Every morning started at 5 a.m. He would make oatmeal for Lucas, pack a small lunch, and double-check his son's homework. There was no room for error in their lives. One missed bus meant a lost shift. One broken tool meant no dinner. David's life was a series of calculated risks, all centered around keeping his son safe. Lucas, his son, was his entire world. Because David couldn't afford childcare, Lucas often came with him to job sites. The boy was used to sitting in the shadows of giants, watching his father work. David taught him 2 things. Never brag about what you can do, and never make an excuse for what you haven't done. Quiet excellence, Lucas, he would say. The world talks too much. Let the work speak. The boy would sit for hours reading science books or drawing complex diagrams in a tattered notebook. He understood the stakes. He saw the way people looked at his father, the invisible man in the blue collar. He saw the condescension, but he also saw the magic in his father's hands. To Lucas, his dad wasn't a janitor. He was a wizard who could make the world move again. Today's project was different. This wasn't a broken HVAC or a leaky pipe. This was the Whitman Industrial Core. It was a marvel of modern engineering, a system designed to power an entire manufacturing sector. If it stayed down, Rachel Whitman would lose a $30 million contract by sunset. The air in the room was thick with desperation. Every minute the red lights flashed, a fortune vanished. Rachel Whitman was a woman who was used to being the smartest person in any room. She grew up in boardrooms. She measured people by the brand of their watch and the sharpness of their suit. To her, David Miller was nothing more than a ghost, a piece of furniture in a work shirt. She didn't know his history. She didn't know he had designed systems 3 times as complex as this one while she was still in finishing school. She didn't care who he was. She only saw a man who looked like he belonged in the basement, not on the command deck. She looked at her watch, a custom Patek Philippe that cost more than David's apartment building. The loss was mounting. Her engineers were failing. The panic in the room was palpable. Men with triple-digit hourly rates were sweating through their silk shirts. They were arguing over schematics, pointing fingers at software bugs, and blaming the hardware manufacturer. And in the middle of this high-stakes nightmare, this janitor was claiming he could fix the world in 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Rachel repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. From you? I have PhDs from MIT who have been sweating over this for 6 hours. What are you going to do, David? Hit it with a hammer? One of the senior engineers, a man named Marcus who wore a lab coat that cost more than David's car, joined in. The arrogance of the uneducated is always fascinating, Marcus sneered. Go back to your corner, Miller. Don't get grease on the sensors. This isn't a tractor. It's a multi-layered neural link power grid. You wouldn't even know how to turn the screen on. David didn't flinch. He didn't defend himself. He didn't mention his credentials. He just stood there, steady as a rock. He watched Marcus try to force a system bypass. The engineer's hands were shaking. He was looking at the symptoms, not the disease. I just need access to the primary control override, David said calmly. Rachel stepped closer, her heels clicking like gunshots on the metal floor. I am not giving a day contractor the keys to a $10 million kingdom. You'll probably blow the whole grid. It's already blown, David replied. The internal temperature of the cooling loop is rising by 2 degrees every minute. In 47 minutes, the core will hit the thermal limit and initiate a hard lock. Once that happens, you won't be fixing it in hours. You'll be replacing it in months. The room went quiet for a heartbeat. Rachel looked at the countdown timer. Exactly 47 minutes remained until the point of no return. She looked back at David. How did he know that? He hadn't even touched a screen. Lucky guess, Marcus muttered, though his hands shook as he adjusted his glasses. He was staring at his own tablet, realizing the math David just did in his head was perfectly accurate. He turned back to the console and tried a manual reboot. The system groaned. A deep metallic shudder ran through the floor. A new alarm began to wail, high-pitched, piercing. Failure, Marcus shouted. The sequence is stalling. We're losing the pressure seal. Get everyone back. Lucas looked up from his crate, his eyes wide. He looked at his father. He knew that look on David's face. It was the look of a man watching a car crash in slow motion. David stepped closer to the rail. He didn't ask for permission this time. He pointed a small, flickering gauge in the corner of the secondary monitor. You're ignoring the frequency oscillation, David said. You're trying to force the gate open when the pressure is still building. You're going to shear the main valve. If that valve goes, the entire bay will be flooded with coolant in seconds. Shut up, Rachel snapped. Marcus, follow the protocol. Manual override, now. She was terrified, but her pride was still in the driver's seat. She couldn't admit that the man in the grease-stained shirt saw something her experts missed. David stepped back. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply pulled his old cracked smartphone from his pocket. He tapped the screen and started a timer. 15 minutes. He leaned against the railing and watched. He watched as the highly paid experts chased their own tails. They were like blind men trying to describe an elephant. They were focused on the software, while the hardware was screaming for air. He watched as Rachel Whitman's empire began to crack under the weight of her own pride. The engineers were frantic. They were inputting codes, pulling cables, and screaming at the software. Marcus was nearly in tears, his face bright red as he slammed his fist against the console. But the machine didn't care about their degrees. It only cared about physics. And physics was currently screaming for help. Rachel looked at the clock. 30 minutes left. The loss was now reaching critical mass. Her investors were calling. Her phone was vibrating in her pocket like a trapped insect. She looked at David. He was standing perfectly still. He looked like he was in a park, not a disaster zone. What makes you so sure? She asked, her voice cracking for a split second. David looked at the machine, then at her. Because I built the prototype for this turbine 6 years ago, and I told the designers then that this specific logic gate would fail if the ambient temperature exceeded 90 degrees. They didn't listen then, and you aren't listening now. The silence that followed was heavier than the machine itself. Rachel stared at him. Marcus stopped typing. You built this? Marcus stammered. That's impossible. This was designed by the Stanton Group. Exactly, David said. And I'm the reason they had to buy the patent from a shell company after they fired me for telling the truth. If you'd like to see how this moment unfolds, you're welcome to subscribe and continue with us. The real truth is about to be revealed. The vibrations changed. It wasn't a hum anymore. It was a growl. The guttural sound of a predator trapped in a cage of its own making. The floor began to thrum with a rhythmic, violent energy. Dust from the rafters drifted down, coating the million-dollar control desks in a fine white powder. Pressure at 98%, Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror. The manifold is warping. It's going to blow the seal. Clear the bay. Clear the bay. The engineers backed away from the console. They were no longer scientists. They were survivors ready to run and leave the $30 million heart of the company to bleed out on the floor. Rachel Whitman stood her ground, but her face was the color of ash. Her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. She looked at her empire, the gleaming lights, the intricate pipes, the promise of a future, and saw it all dissolving into a cloud of superheated steam. David Miller moved. He didn't run. He walked with a calculated, heavy purpose, his boots echoing against the metal floor like the tolling of a bell. He stepped past Marcus, who was trembling, clutching a tablet like a shield. He stepped past the other engineers who were paralyzed by fear, their theoretical knowledge useless in the face of a physical meltdown. He stood in front of Rachel. He was so close she could smell the faint scent of copper and cheap laundry detergent on his shirt. Your fail-safe loop is inverted, David said. His voice was a low thunder that somehow stayed below the screeching of the alarms. The software thinks the heat is coming from the outside, so it's closing the vents to protect the core. But the heat is internal. You're cooking it from the inside out. The room went dead silent. Even the machine seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, as if listening to its creator. Marcus froze. He looked at his tablet. He looked at the logic gate on the screen, scrolling frantically through the subdirectories of the cooling system. His jaw dropped. He's right, Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. The logic is flipped. It's a legacy bug from the 2.0 update. How did we miss that? We were checking the voltage, not the directionality. Because you were looking at the data you wanted to see, David said, not the data the machine was giving you. You wanted to see a software bug, but the machine was telling you it was starving for air. Rachel looked at David. For the first time, she didn't see a janitor. She saw a predator, a man who mastered the lightning that powered her world. Fix it, she commanded. The mockery was gone. It was replaced by a desperate, raw plea. David didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a contract. He didn't ask for an apology. He didn't try to negotiate while her house was on fire. He just worked. He reached for the control panel. His fingers moved with a grace that left the other engineers breathless. He wasn't looking at the keyboard. He was looking at the turbine itself, listening to the pitch of the vibration, feeling the frequency through the soles of his boots. He bypassed the primary OS with a series of keystrokes that seemed to rewrite the very rules of the system. He went straight into the kernel, the black box where the machine's soul lived. He began to reroute the cooling logic manually, carving a path through the code that no manual had ever described. The clock on the wall was ticking. The heat was unbearable now, the humidity rising as the cooling system stalled. Sweat was pouring down David's face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. Lucas stood up from his crate. He didn't look scared anymore. He stood tall, his small chest puffed out. He knew his father was the master of this world. He watched as the great millionaire stood in awe of the man she had just laughed at. Wait, honest you, Marcus shouted, trying to regain some authority. You can't do that. You'll bypass the emergency shutoff. If you're wrong, the whole building goes. The emergency shutoff is what's killing it, David replied without looking back. It's holding its breath until its lungs burst. I'm giving it a chance to breathe. He slammed his palm against the enter key. For 3 seconds, everything stopped. The lights went black. The wailing sirens died. The hum of the computers vanished. The silence was terrifying. It was the silence of a vacuum. Rachel Whitman held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt the weight of her entire life, every board meeting, every sacrifice, every win, hanging on a single line of code written by a man she didn't even know. Then, a hum. Not a growl. A deep, melodic, perfect hum. The red lights on the wall flickered. They turned amber. Then, one by one, they turned a brilliant, steady green. The cooling fans roared to life, venting the trapped heat into the exhaust stacks with a sound like a jet engine taking off. The pressure gauge dropped like a stone. 100, 80, 60, stable. David looked at his phone. The timer was blinking. 14 minutes and 52 seconds. He looked at the millionaire. Her jaw was set, her eyes wide, her pride shattered on the floor like broken glass. Nobody was laughing anymore. Rachel Whitman stayed in that position for a long time. She looked at the screens, seeing the numbers return to perfection. The output was actually 5% higher than it had been before the crash. David hadn't just fixed it, he had optimized it. He had found efficiency in the chaos. Then she looked at David. He was wiping his hands on a greasy rag, the same one he had been using all morning. He looked exactly the same as he did 15 minutes ago. Dirty, tired, and invisible. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't gloating. He didn't look at her for approval. He just looked at his son. "Who are you?" Rachel finally whispered. The question wasn't an insult this time. It was a genuine mystery, a crack in her reality. David finished wiping his hands. He tucked the rag into his back pocket. "I'm the man you hired to do the maintenance, Ms. Whitman," he said, his voice flat. "No," she stepped forward, the luxury of her office forgotten. "Maintenance men don't rewrite industrial kernels in 14 minutes. You knew exactly where the fault was before you even touched the console. You knew the frequency oscillation patterns. You are David Miller, aren't you? The real David Miller." David paused. He looked her in the eye, and for a moment, the ghost of the brilliant engineer he once was flickered in his gaze. "I was David Miller," he said. "Now I'm just a father trying to finish his shift before the buses stop running." "I've heard of you," she said, her voice softening as the pieces fell into place. "The whistleblower from the Stanton project. They said you were crazy. They said you were a loose cannon who didn't know what he was talking about. They said you tried to sabotage the grid to hide your own errors." David glanced at the green lights. "The machines don't lie. People do. They fired me because I told them their budget cuts would lead to a meltdown in 3 years. It's been 3 years in Haithang. I guess they were right. I was off by 60 days. Rachel looked around the room. She saw her elite team of engineers looking at the floor in shame. She saw the expensive equipment, the high-tech sensors, and the luxury of her surroundings. She realized something that hit her harder than the $30 million loss would have. She had spent her life surrounding herself with people who told her what she wanted to hear. She had paid for loyalty and prestige, but she had neglected the truth. She had built a kingdom on a foundation of yes men, and it had almost buried her. She had laughed at the only person who had the courage and the skill to tell her the truth. Lucas walked over to his father and took his hand. "Can we go now, Dad?" the boy asked. "I finished my homework. I even did the extra credit." David nodded, a small, genuine smile finally touching his face. "Yes, son, we're done here." One of the junior engineers started to clap. It was a weak, hesitant sound. Then he stopped, realizing Rachel hadn't moved. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with the realization that the hierarchy of the room had been completely inverted. The man with the grease on his face was the most powerful person there. Rachel realized that David hadn't just saved her contract. He had saved her entire career. If that core had melted, the investigation would have found the inverted logic loop, and it would have been her signature on the failure report. She would have been the one the world blamed for the blackouts. She had been minutes away from total ruin, and the man she had mocked, the man she had treated like a ghost, had reached out and pulled her back from the ledge. She looked at David's back as he started to walk away toward the service exit. She felt a cold shiver. She had nearly destroyed a man who was a master of his craft, simply because he didn't fit her image of success. She had almost let her pride kill the heartbeat of her company. The silence of the room felt like a judgment. She felt the eyes of her staff on her. They were waiting to see if she would be big enough to admit she was wrong. "Mr. Miller," she called out, her voice no longer that of a boss. It was the voice of a woman who had just been humbled. David stopped at the heavy steel doors. He didn't turn around immediately. He waited. I didn't listen, she said. It was a small admission, but in that room, it sounded like a confession. Most people don't, David replied, finally turning his head. They're too busy listening to the sound of their own success to hear the machine screaming for help. Wait, Rachel called out again, hurrying toward him before the heavy doors could close. David stopped. He turned slowly, holding Lucas's hand. The boy looked at the millionaire with a curious, guarded expression. I want to offer you a position, Rachel said, her voice regaining some of its business authority, but with an underlying tremor of respect. Head of Systems Engineering. Not just for this site, but for the entire division. Full benefits. A salary 5 times what you're making now. I'll clear your name. I have the connections to undo what Stanton did to you. I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll make sure the world knows you were right. David finally turned fully. He looked at the gleaming office at the top of the bay. He looked at the power she was offering. He saw the path back to the life he once had. The status, the money, the security. He saw a future where Lucas didn't have to sit on crates in maintenance bays. Then he looked down at Lucas. Lucas didn't say anything. He just held his father's hand. He looked at his dad with the same expression he had when they were eating oatmeal in their cold apartment. To the boy, his father was already a hero. He didn't need a title to prove it. David knew what that world was like. He knew the politics. He knew the backstabbing. He knew how easily a director can be turned into a scapegoat when things go wrong. I have a condition, David said. Rachel nodded eagerly. Anything. You name it. I want independent safety authority, David said. If I see a flaw, I stop the line. No board meetings, no votes, no checking the stock price first. I say it's broken. It stays broken. Cho Gen Ki, it's fixed. And I want my son to have a scholarship fund. Not from the company, from you. A personal guarantee that no matter what happens to me, his education is secure. Rachel didn't even blink. Done. I'll have the legal team draw up the contracts by morning. You have my word. Personal and professional. David looked at her for a long moment. He was searching for the lie. But all he saw was the reflection of a woman who had finally learned the value of a man's worth. He didn't smile. He didn't thank her. He wasn't doing this for her. He was doing this for the boy holding his hand. I'll be here at 8 a.m., he said. Don't be late. I don't like wasting time. And Ms. Whitman? Yes? Tell your engineers to throw away their tablets and start listening to the machines. A screen only tells you what it's programmed to tell you. The metal tells you the truth. He turned and walked out of the maintenance bay, his son skipping slightly to keep up with his long strides. The engineers watched them go. Marcus was still staring at the code David had written. He was trying to memorize the syntax, the way David had woven the logic together. It's beautiful, Marcus whispered to men. It's like he was talking to the machine, and it was talking back. Rachel Whitman walked over to the console. She looked at the timer David had set on his phone, which he had accidentally left on the ledge. It had stopped at 14:52. She picked it up. The screen was cracked. The case was cheap plastic. It was a relic of a hard life, but it held more power than anything she owned. She realized then that the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones who scream for attention. They aren't the ones who brag about their millions or their degrees. The most dangerous and the most valuable are the ones who can walk into a room of chaos, look at the disaster, and calmly tell you exactly how long it will take to fix it. She looked at the green lights one last time. Nobody was laughing anymore. The room was quiet, respectful, and finally, working. As she walked back to her office, she looked at the heavy phone in her hand. She didn't put it down. She held it like a reminder. Because sometimes the quietest promise is the only one that matters. And a man who has nothing left to lose, but his integrity is the only man you can truly trust to keep the world spinning. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. Sometimes the quietest promise is the most accurate. Thank you for watching.